the film opens with a brief historical explanation. Following the September 11 attacks, the United States sent approximately 10,000 troops into Afghanistan. A decade later, the American military presence in the country had expanded dramatically, reaching almost 100,000 personnel. To support military operations, the armed forces recruited local interpreters. In exchange for their dangerous service, these translators and their immediate families were promised visas that would allow them to relocate to the United States. On a brutally hot afternoon, Master Sergeant John Kinley leads his unit through a roadside checkpoint operation. Their interpreter, Haiti, works alongside Jizzy, questioning motorists about where they are heading and what they are transporting. One driver immediately begins acting irritated by the interrogation. His growing hostility catches the attention of Tomcat and JJ, who closely monitor the situation. Realizing the man's behavior is becoming increasingly suspicious, Kinley orders Haiti and Jizzy to inspect the rear cargo section of the truck. At the same time, Chow Chow and Jack Jack move into tactical positions, ready to respond if anything goes wrong. The driver is soon soaked in sweat, his nervousness becoming impossible to hide. Overcome by panic, he suddenly tries to escape. Before the soldiers can react, an explosive device hidden inside the vehicle detonates. The devastating blast kills Jizzy and Haiti, leaving Kinley and the surviving members of his unit mourning the loss of their comrades. With both men gone, the team urgently needs another interpreter before continuing its operations. After carefully considering the available candidates, Kinley chooses Ahmed because of the strong recommendations attached to his record. Ahmed quickly makes an impression. He is intelligent, composed under pressure, observant, and clearly unwilling to be intimidated. Kinley has few doubts about the decision and believes Ahmed will become a valuable addition to the unit. With the new team assembled, the soldiers resume their mission to locate Taliban facilities being used to manufacture improvised explosive devices. The following day, the unit continues patrolling through the local streets until they arrive at a suspicious building positioned near the end of the road. Ahmed recognizes the location and warns Kinley that they will probably need additional assistance to find what they are searching for. Kinley refuses to abandon the lead. A thin, nervous-looking man eventually appears at the entrance. Although he is clearly uncomfortable with the soldiers' presence, he reluctantly allows them inside. However, instead of discovering an explosives workshop, the team finds a crowded hookah lounge. Several people lie unconscious around the room, while pipes, cushions, and smoking equipment are scattered across the floor. Realizing they have followed another useless lead, Kinley drops into a nearby chair. Frustration washes over him as the operation ends without producing anything of value. Several days later, the unit drives deep into the desert after receiving intelligence that the Taliban may be producing explosive devices somewhere in the area. During the journey, a second interpreter claims that the main road ahead has become unusable because recent rainfall washed it out. He recommends taking another route instead. Kinley accepts the suggestion, and the convoy changes direction. As they continue along the unfamiliar path, Ahmed becomes increasingly uneasy. He warns Kinley that something feels wrong and urges him to reconsider the route. Taking Ahmed's concern seriously, Kinley orders the vehicles to stop. He sends 2 soldiers to the top of a nearby ridge to inspect the surrounding terrain. Another member of the unit contacts aerial surveillance and requests an immediate scan of the area. The soldiers report that the ridge appears clear. There is no visible sign of enemy fighters waiting nearby. Kinley then turns toward Ahmed, only to find that Ahmed has already attacked the second interpreter. Ahmed forces the man onto the ground and presses a weapon against his neck. Kinley raises his rifle and orders Ahmed to lower his gun. Ahmed pauses, unwilling to release the man, but eventually obeys. The terrified second interpreter then admits the truth. The Taliban have captured his family and threaten to kill them unless he guides Kinley's unit directly into a trap. Moments later, aerial surveillance confirms Ahmed's suspicions. A large Taliban force is positioned nearby, waiting to ambush the convoy. Had the team continued along the route for only a few more minutes, they would have driven directly into the attack. After returning to the military base, Kinley investigates Ahmed's background more closely. He learns that Ahmed volunteered to assist the United States military after the Taliban brutally murdered his young son. This discovery gives Kinley a much clearer understanding of what drives Ahmed. His decision to work with the Americans is not simply about money or obtaining a visa. It is deeply personal. Even so, Kinley makes one thing absolutely clear. Ahmed must never disobey a direct command again, regardless of how strong his instincts may be. Later, Kinley speaks with his superior, Colonel Vokes, and openly vents his frustration over the restrictions placed on his unit. The official rules prevent him from pursuing leads as aggressively as he believes necessary. Vokes cannot formally authorize Kinley to operate outside established military boundaries, but he also does not tell him to stop. Sergeant O'Brady overhears their exchange and quietly gives Kinley the one thing he needs to continue his investigation: a name. Using this new information, Kinley's team tracks down and corners the individual. However, instead of finding a Taliban operative, they discover that the man is a local drug dealer with connections across the region. Kinley expects Ahmed to translate the interrogation directly, but Ahmed handles the situation differently. Rather than repeating every question word for word, he begins negotiating with the dealer in his own way, trying to convince him that cooperating is his safest option. Ahmed throws a bundle of cash toward the man, hoping the payment will loosen his tongue. The dealer remains stubborn and refuses to provide any useful information. Instead, he responds with threats, claiming he will hunt down Ahmed's family and harm them while forcing Ahmed to watch. Ahmed studies the dealer carefully, weighing the threat and the man's intentions. Then, without showing fear, he tosses another stack of money in his direction. Kinley immediately disapproves. He does not like Ahmed changing the terms of the interrogation or spending money without permission, and his frustration is obvious. Ahmed ignores the reaction and continues working on the dealer, steadily applying pressure until the man finally gives in. The dealer reveals two separate locations, connected to the manufacture of improvised explosive devices. His information makes it clear that the Taliban is not operating one large, centralized bomb factory. Instead, the production process has been divided across several sites. Different components are prepared in different places before being transported and assembled elsewhere. Each location, therefore, represents only one stage of a much larger operation. Armed with this intelligence, Kinley and his unit move into the desert to investigate. This time, they finally strike gold. At the isolated site, they uncover evidence confirming that the location is part of the Taliban's IED network. Kinley immediately radios the base and reports the discovery. Reinforcements are dispatched, but the additional troops will need approximately 15 minutes to reach them. Knowing the unit cannot remain exposed in the open for long, Kinley decides not to wait. He orders the team to push deeper into the compound and continue clearing the area. During their search, the soldiers come across 3 men brutally torturing an Afghan prisoner. Unfortunately, they arrive too late to save him. Before they can fully secure the site, more Taliban fighters begin pouring into the area. A violent gun battle erupts. Kinley's men fight desperately, but they are badly outnumbered. One by one, the members of the unit are overwhelmed and killed. Within moments, the operation collapses, and nearly the entire team is lost. Amid the chaos, Kinley and Ahmed manage to escape by stealing one of the Taliban's pickup trucks. They race away from the compound, while roughly a dozen enemy fighters pursue them across the desert. Their escape quickly becomes a desperate struggle for survival. Not long afterward, American forces reach the destroyed site. However, they arrive too late to save the unit, and can only begin recovering the bodies of Kinley's fallen soldiers. Meanwhile, Kinley and Ahmed continue driving until one of the truck's tires goes flat. With the vehicle no longer usable and the Taliban still tracking them, they are forced to abandon it. The 2 men turn to the landscape for protection, moving away from the open desert and into the rough terrain of the nearby wooded mountains. They use the hills, rocks, and dense surroundings to hide their trail as they continue deeper into the wilderness. Their only objective is to avoid the pursuing fighters and somehow make their way back to the American base. However, they soon discover another major problem. Their radios are too far from the base to establish contact. With no signal and no way to call for extraction, Kinley and Ahmed are completely isolated. As darkness falls, they have no choice but to spend the night in the cold, unforgiving mountains. The Taliban fighters hunting them remain close behind. After reporting the situation to their commander, they receive strict instructions to capture Kinley and Ahmed at any cost. At sunrise, Kinley wakes Ahmed so they can continue moving. To their surprise, the radio suddenly picks up a faint signal. Rather than bringing relief, the transmission warns them that their enemies are somewhere nearby. Realizing the Taliban is closing in, the 2 men quickly gather their equipment and increase their pace toward the base. While passing through a valley, Kinley and Ahmed encounter 2 men blocking their route. To avoid creating noise with gunfire, they attack silently, using knives to eliminate the men before continuing. Later, as they cross another hill, 2 Taliban scouts observe the surrounding landscape through binoculars. Kinley and Ahmed nearly slip past them without being detected, but but at the last possible moment, one of the scouts spots movement. With their position exposed and immediate danger approaching, Kinley and Ahmed are forced to open fire. The gunshots echo loudly through the canyon, carrying across the mountains and revealing their location to the Taliban search parties. Their pursuers now know exactly where they are, and the distance between them begins shrinking rapidly. Kinley and Ahmed rush toward a nearby house and take shelter inside. Kinley desperately searches for another exit or any route that might allow them to escape before the Taliban surrounds the building. During the attack, however, Kinley is struck several times. Bullets tear into his leg, the side of his abdomen, and his shoulder, leaving him severely wounded and struggling to remain conscious. Ahmed suddenly appears from behind cover and takes down the Taliban fighters attacking Kinley. With no time to waste, he seizes one of their trucks, lifts the badly injured sergeant into the cargo bed, and covers him beneath layers of rugs and blankets. Ahmed sticks to the main roads for as long as he safely can, hoping the faster route will bring them closer to friendly territory. Along the way, he comes across 3 Taliban fighters stranded beside the road with a broken-down vehicle. They stop him and demand transportation. Ahmed has no choice but to agree. One of the men climbs into the passenger seat beside him, while the other 2 settle into the rear of the truck, only inches away from Kinley. Hidden beneath the blankets, Kinley remains perfectly still, suppressing every sound despite the pain tearing through his body. Ahmed claims that he works as a merchant, and the entire deception depends on keeping Kinley concealed. If the fighters discover an American soldier in the back, both men will be killed immediately. After eventually getting rid of the unwanted passengers, Ahmed pulls into a safer location and examines Kinley's wounds. He does what little he can with the supplies available, treating the bleeding and applying temporary dressings to keep the sergeant alive. Ahmed then moves them again before the Taliban can track the truck. At another settlement, he trades the pickup for medicine, food, water, and a small 2-wheeled wooden cart. The vehicle is no longer safe to use, so the rest of the journey must be made on foot. Ahmed places Kinley onto the cart and begins pushing him through the mountains. Every slope demands enormous effort. The wheels catch against rocks, the trails become increasingly steep, and Ahmed is forced to use every ounce of his strength to drag the wounded soldier upward. To shield Kinley from the punishing heat, he lays thin blankets across his body, careful not to suffocate him beneath the fabric. Kinley drifts between consciousness and darkness throughout the journey. At times, he opens his eyes without fully understanding where he is. Seconds later, the exhaustion and blood loss pull him back under. When night arrives, Kinley awakens in unbearable agony. His wounds have worsened, and every movement sends another wave of pain through him. Ahmed cannot offer proper medical care, but he stays close and does whatever he can to calm him, reassuring Kinley that they are still moving toward safety. The next day, after countless hours of climbing, Ahmed finally reaches a high point on the mountain. From the ridge, he can see the American base in the distance, only a few miles away. For the first time since escaping the compound, their destination is visible. Ahmed continues forward and eventually stops at a small roadside stall to purchase water. However, their presence does not go unnoticed. Several Taliban trucks soon appear nearby, and the fighters begin studying Ahmed with suspicion. One of them approaches the cart and starts lifting the blankets. Ahmed watches closely as the man searches beneath the coverings. Within moments, the fighter discovers Kinley lying underneath. Ahmed reacts before anyone can raise the alarm. He quickly draws his weapon and eliminates the Taliban fighters around him. The confrontation ends within seconds, but Ahmed is physically exhausted and barely capable of standing. Almost immediately afterward, American forces arrive at the location. The soldiers surround Ahmed and order him to raise his hands. Too drained to resist or explain the situation properly, he obeys. They force him to the ground, place him in handcuffs, and treat him as a possible enemy. Ahmed urgently tells them that Sergeant Kinley is inside the cart. One of the soldiers pulls back the blankets and freezes in disbelief. Kinley, who had been presumed dead along with the rest of his unit, is somehow still alive. Kinley later regains consciousness inside a military hospital. His memories come in broken fragments, shifting between brief moments of awareness and long periods of darkness. The next clear thing he remembers is being back home in Santa Clarita, California. He stands at the grill preparing steaks for his wife and children, trying to return to the rhythm of normal family life. From the outside, everything appears peaceful, yet there is a distant emptiness behind his eyes, revealing that some part of him is still trapped in Afghanistan. Kinley soon learns that Ahmed never received the visa he had been promised. Instead, Ahmed, his wife, and their infant child have been forced into hiding while they wait for the application to be approved. Determined to repay the man who saved his life, Kinley begins contacting military offices, government departments, and anyone else who might be able to help. Every attempt leads to another obstacle. He spends hours making calls, only to be transferred between departments or left listening to hold music. Each time someone finally answers, he is forced to repeat the entire story from the beginning. His requests produce nothing. After sitting on hold for nearly 3 hours during one call, Kinley finally starts drinking. His frustration has turned into exhaustion, and the helplessness is beginning to affect him. His family notices the change in his behavior and grows increasingly worried. Officials tell Kinley that Ahmed cannot receive a visa until a complete background investigation has been performed. The explanation makes no sense to him, especially because the process apparently includes checking Ahmed's 3-month-old baby. Late one night, Kinley sits alone in his office and continues making calls. Once again, he is placed on hold while attempting to push the application forward. When the line suddenly disconnects, his anger explodes. He lashes out in frustration, realizing that every effort has led him to another dead end. Back in Afghanistan, Ahmed is hiding with his wife and their 3-month-old child. Without warning, he receives a phone call from an informant who tells him that the Taliban has discovered their location. The caller orders him to leave immediately through the rear entrance. Ahmed moves toward the back door, but stops when he notices a man already standing outside. His wife quickly grabs the emergency bag they keep packed for situations like this. Ahmed positions himself behind the door and waits. When the intruder enters, Ahmed attacks him from behind and kills him before he can alert the others. The family immediately escapes through the rear of the building, just as Taliban fighters storm through the front entrance. Once outside, Ahmed cannot run openly without attracting attention. He and his family must disappear into the crowded streets and behave as though nothing is wrong. Searching desperately for somewhere to hide, they enter another family's home and quickly sit down at the dinner table. They pretend to be relatives or invited guests, calmly joining the meal while Taliban fighters search the surrounding area. After the street finally clears, Ahmed leads his wife and baby outside. The three of them climb into the rear of a passing truck and manage to escape before the Taliban can locate them. Meanwhile, Kinley is offered another possible solution. If the government will not act quickly enough, he can hire private military contractors to enter Afghanistan and extract Ahmed's family. The operation will be extremely expensive. Kinley's wife suggests taking out a second mortgage on their home to pay for it. She understands that he will never truly recover, while the man who saved him remains trapped and hunted. With his decision made, Kinley contacts Colonel Vokes and demands that the visas be completed and waiting once Ahmed reaches safety. Vokes warns him that the Taliban has placed a bounty on his head. Returning to Afghanistan would make Kinley one of their most valuable targets. Kinley understands the danger, but he also knows that ignoring Ahmed's situation is no longer possible. Rescuing him is the only path that might finally bring him peace and allow him to settle the debt that has consumed him. After saying goodbye to his wife and children, Kinley travels back to Afghanistan using the false name Ron K. Upon arrival, he meets the man responsible for organizing the private extraction. However, he quickly learns that the original plan has changed. A United Nations official is expected to visit the area, forcing the contractors to postpone Ron's mission until the security operation surrounding the visit is complete. Kinley refuses to accept the postponement. Ahmed and his family have already spent too long hiding from the Taliban, and delaying the operation could cost them their lives. He insists that the extraction must proceed according to the original plan, even if he has to carry it out without the contractor team. After receiving a truck, weapons, and the necessary equipment, Kinley prepares for a meeting that has been arranged with Ahmed's brother. The man is supposed to help guide him through Taliban-controlled territory and lead him to Ahmed's current hiding place. When Kinley arrives, he learns why Ahmed's brother has been allowed to continue operating without interference. His business survives because he supplies heroin to the Taliban, creating a profitable arrangement that protects him from their attention. Understanding that both men need each other, Ahmed's brother agrees to assist. He assigns one of his trusted drivers to transport Kinley to the location where Ahmed and his family are hiding. The driver's presence will allow Kinley to pass through the region without drawing immediate suspicion, and with luck, complete the evacuation before the Taliban realizes what is happening. During the journey, they are stopped at a checkpoint. One of the guards becomes suspicious and demands to inspect the rear compartment of the vehicle, unaware that Kinley is concealed inside. The man moves closer and begins searching the truck. Realizing that discovery is only seconds away, Kinley has no choice but to attack. He kills the checkpoint worker before the man can raise an alarm. Kinley and the driver quickly move the body away from the road and hide it near the riverbank. They believe they have acted without being seen, but a Taliban informant has witnessed everything from a distance. The spy immediately contacts his commanders and reports the incident. He also manages to photograph Kinley, giving the Taliban undeniable confirmation that the American soldier has returned to Afghanistan. Once Kinley's identity is verified, the Taliban commander understands the importance of the opportunity. He deploys additional fighters and orders the informant to remain close behind Kinley. The instructions are simple: track him and ensure that he is captured, whether alive or dead. The danger surrounding the rescue mission has now increased dramatically. Elsewhere, Ahmed is working on the engine of a pickup truck, while his wife sits nearby with their infant at a picnic table. Several civilians move around the area, making the location appear ordinary and peaceful. Then Ahmed hears a voice he recognizes instantly. He turns and sees Kinley approaching in disguise, wearing glasses and traditional clothing to avoid attracting attention. Ahmed is stunned. He never expected Kinley to return, especially after everything that happened between them. Kinley quickly reveals the reason for his arrival. He has secured the visas that Ahmed and his family were promised. For the first time in months, Ahmed sees a genuine path out of Afghanistan. The documents offer more than permission to travel. They represent the possibility of survival and a new life beyond the Taliban's reach. There is no time for a long reunion. Ahmed gathers his wife and baby, and the family quickly climbs into the back of the driver's truck. Kinley knows the Taliban is already searching for him, so he contacts the private contractor team and reports that the situation has become urgent. The contractors immediately begin mobilizing reinforcements. At the operations center, a computer specialist completes a background search on Kinley's false identity, Ron K. The results reveal that the man using the alias is actually Master Sergeant John Kinley. The head of the private operation realizes that he has made a serious mistake. He had delayed Kinley's rescue mission in order to prioritize security for the visiting United Nations official, without understanding who Kinley was or how dangerous the situation had become. Determined to correct the decision, he orders immediate air support. He requests an aircraft carrying devastating firepower and directs it toward Kinley's position. The heavily armed plane is given an appropriate code name, the Angel of Death. The deployment shows that the contractors are now fully committed to protecting Kinley and completing the extraction. Meanwhile, the Taliban sends more vehicles and fighters toward the group's location. As the enemy closes in, Kinley and Ahmed open fire on the nearest pursuit vehicle. Their bullets cause the truck to crash, blocking the road and temporarily slowing the fighters behind it. The advantage does not last long. When the group reaches a tunnel, they realize their vehicle can no longer carry them to safety. They are forced to abandon it and continue on foot. Kinley orders the driver to position the truck inside the tunnel, using it as an obstacle that will delay the pursuing Taliban convoy. Before leaving, Kinley places a grenade near the vehicle. The Taliban fighters enter the tunnel moments later. The grenade explodes at exactly the right time, destroying the obstruction and buying the group several additional minutes. Kinley, Ahmed, and the others move toward the far end of the tunnel and emerge near a dam. For the moment, the structure gives them some protection from the fighters approaching behind them. They take defensive positions on one side of the canyon. The driver begins firing at Taliban gunmen positioned across the gap, nearly a quarter of a mile away. The enemy fighters answer with a heavy stream of gunfire. Bullets strike the concrete and metal surrounding Kinley and Ahmed as they return fire from the opposite side. Ahmed's wife carries their baby into a small shed on the dam, shielding the child from the battle unfolding outside. The gunfight continues, but the defenders are steadily running out of ammunition. The driver is suddenly struck and killed, leaving Kinley and Ahmed to hold the position alone. Kinley fires until his weapon is completely empty. Ahmed checks his pistol and realizes that only a handful of rounds remain. He uses the last of his ammunition against the advancing fighters, but it is not enough to stop them. The Taliban begins moving toward Kinley's position. With no bullets left and nowhere else to run, it appears that the rescue has failed only moments before reaching safety. Then a sound rolls across the sky. The Angel of Death suddenly appears overhead. The aircraft unleashes its weapons on the Taliban forces below. Its firepower tears through the enemy positions, eliminating every fighter advancing on Kinley and Ahmed. Within moments, the entire Taliban group is destroyed. A helicopter soon arrives and evacuates Kinley, Ahmed, and Ahmed's family from the dam. After being flown out of the combat zone, they are taken to a military transport plane that will carry them safely to the United States. As they prepare to leave Afghanistan behind, Kinley and Ahmed exchange a silent but deeply meaningful look. Neither man needs to speak. The glance reflects everything they have endured together, the lives they saved, the sacrifices they made, and the debt of loyalty that each has now repaid. Their relationship began as a military assignment, but it has become something far deeper, built on trust, courage, and mutual respect. As the film reaches its conclusion, text appears on the screen explaining the devastating reality faced by Afghan interpreters after the withdrawal of international military forces from Afghanistan. Thousands of men who assisted American and Allied troops were left behind while waiting for promised visas. Many were later executed because of their cooperation with foreign armed forces. Others remain in hiding with their families, living under the constant fear that the Taliban will eventually. There's something a little strange about The Covenant. You look at the people involved, Guy Ritchie directing, Jake Gyllenhaal leading the cast, and assume it must have been a fairly big release. Maybe not a billion-dollar blockbuster, obviously, but at least the kind of film that gets a proper theatrical push and finds a solid audience. That really didn't happen. The movie failed to earn back even half of its reported production cost at the box office, which is surprising because this isn't some confused disaster that audiences wisely avoided. It's a well-made, serious war thriller with recognizable talent, strong performances, and a story built around a real moral failure that deserves attention. Yet it came and went with barely any noise. Part of that may simply be the subject matter. By the time this film arrived, audiences had already spent years watching stories about Afghanistan, Iraq, terrorism, military occupation, and the consequences of the war on terror. There's probably a level of exhaustion there. A lot of people see soldiers, desert landscapes, and the Taliban in a trailer and immediately assume they already know the movie. And to be fair, The Covenant does look familiar at first glance. You have an American military unit operating in hostile territory. There are roadside bombs, gunfights, ambushes, and men moving carefully through landscapes where danger could appear from almost anywhere. On the surface, it has the same pieces as dozens of modern war films, but the movie is better than the generic version suggested by its marketing. Some viewers have gone as far as calling it one of the finest films made about the Afghanistan war. That is a huge statement, especially when war cinema has such a long history of genuinely defining films. The Second World War has Saving Private Ryan. Vietnam has Platoon and Apocalypse Now. Iraq produced films such as The Hurt Locker and Jarhead. Afghanistan, despite lasting 2 decades and shaping an entire generation, has not produced nearly as many films that stayed in the cultural conversation. Whether The Covenant becomes that defining Afghanistan film is debatable. I'm not sure it has the complexity or lasting impact of the very best war movies ever made. Still, it does something that many of them don't. Instead of trying to explain the entire conflict, it narrows everything down to a promise between 2 people. That smaller focus is probably the film's greatest strength. This isn't really a movie about winning a war. In fact, the broader historical outcome makes the idea of victory feel almost irrelevant. It's about what happens when governments leave, institutions stop answering, and the responsibility falls on one person who refuses to pretend that a promise no longer matters. That human angle is why the reactions have been so divided. For some viewers, the film is gripping, emotional, and surprisingly thoughtful. They see it as one of Guy Ritchie's strongest recent projects, maybe even one of the better films in his career. It proves that he can move beyond fast-talking criminals, elaborate schemes, and stylish British chaos. He can step back, control himself, and tell a serious story without constantly reminding you that you're watching a Guy Ritchie movie. Other viewers had almost the opposite response. They found it competent but generic. Another polished war thriller with familiar characters, predictable developments, and action scenes that gradually become more exaggerated. There are people who admired the performances and still walked away thinking, was that it? Not because anything was especially bad, but because very little felt completely new. I understand that reaction too. The movie occasionally seems caught between 2 identities. One is a restrained, morally uncomfortable drama about abandoned Afghan interpreters. The other is a large-scale Hollywood rescue film designed to send the audience home feeling relieved and inspired. Those 2 approaches don't always fit together smoothly. At its best, The Covenant feels grounded and almost painfully direct. At other times, it becomes much more conventional, with the kind of battlefield heroism and overwhelming military firepower that can undermine some of the questions the story is trying to raise. That contradiction matters when discussing its place among war films. The greatest entries in the genre usually leave behind something difficult to shake. They may disturb you, challenge your assumptions, or change how you think about the conflict being portrayed. The Covenant certainly has moments that reach for that level, particularly when it deals with the people who risked their lives helping foreign troops and were later trapped by bureaucracy or simply abandoned. But the film also wants to entertain. It wants suspense, momentum, shootouts, and a satisfying payoff. There's nothing automatically wrong with that. War films have always existed somewhere between historical reflection and cinematic spectacle. The question is whether those elements strengthen each other or compete for attention. Here, they do a bit of both. Even so, calling the movie disposable feels unfair. It may use familiar genre machinery, but the subject underneath it isn't disposable at all. Thousands of interpreters and local allies placed themselves and their families in danger because they were promised protection. The film takes that reality and turns it into a personal story rather than a political lecture. That choice makes it accessible, though perhaps less challenging than it could have been. It also explains why some audiences connected with it so strongly. You don't need a deep understanding of military policy or Afghanistan's history to understand the central idea. Someone saves your life. Later, that person is in danger. Everyone around you provides excuses for doing nothing. What do you do? Simple question, not a simple answer. The box office failure may eventually become part of the film's reputation. This feels like the kind of movie people discover later through streaming, watch with low expectations, and then wonder why it wasn't discussed more when it came out. It didn't receive the theatrical audience its supporters believe it deserved, and honestly, I can see why they feel that way. Is it one of the greatest war films ever made? That might be pushing it. Is it the definitive film about Afghanistan? Probably too early and perhaps too generous to say, but it is far better than its commercial performance suggests. It's tense, sincere, and made with a level of seriousness that many viewers probably weren't expecting from Guy Ritchie. Even when it leans into familiar territory, it has enough emotional weight to avoid becoming just another anonymous military action movie. And considering how quietly it disappeared from cinemas, that may be the biggest surprise of all. The Covenant starts in a way that feels fairly familiar for a modern military thriller. We're in Afghanistan. The war has been grinding on for years, and Master Sergeant John Kinley is leading a small unit tasked with finding Taliban bomb-making operations. The danger isn't presented as something far away or theatrical. It's close. Roadside checks, suspicious vehicles, half-trusted information, men watching rooftops and doorways because one wrong assumption could end the mission in seconds. That becomes clear almost immediately when Kinley loses members of his team, including his interpreter, in an explosion. He needs a replacement, and that's how Ahmed enters the story. Ahmed isn't introduced as the warm, instantly loyal partner that these films sometimes give their American lead. He has his own manner, his own instincts, and a habit of doing things differently from the way Kinley expects. He questions information. He reads people before translating their words. Sometimes he pushes past the limits of what Kinley thinks an interpreter should be doing. Naturally, Kinley doesn't love that. Their early relationship has friction in it, which is important because the film doesn't pretend trust appears the moment they shake hands. Kinley sees Ahmed as an employee attached to the unit. Ahmed knows that surviving in Afghanistan requires more than following American military procedure exactly as written. The tension between them gives the first section of the film its personality. Ahmed isn't merely repeating conversations in another language. He is judging tone, spotting lies, and understanding social signals the soldiers around him can't read. He occasionally changes the direction of an interaction because he senses something Kinley doesn't. That makes him useful, but also unpredictable from Kinley's point of view. Slowly, though, the results speak for themselves. The unit begins making progress. Ahmed proves that his decisions aren't careless. He understands how local networks operate, how fear changes people's answers, and how quickly a seemingly ordinary location can become dangerous. The film spends enough time with the squad to create a rhythm. They travel, question people, follow leads, and search for the places where explosives are being built. There's humor here and there, some casual soldier banter, but the atmosphere never fully relaxes. You always feel like something is waiting beneath the surface. Eventually, the team is sent far from its base to investigate a suspected weapons site. They find what they're looking for, but the mission turns into an ambush. The unit is overwhelmed, and within a short period of time, the story strips almost everyone away. What remains is Kinley, badly wounded, and Ahmed, now responsible for getting both of them out alive. This is where the film changes. The first act has the shape of a unit-based war movie. There's a mission, a group of soldiers, and the threat of an organized enemy closing in. Once the ambush happens, that structure disappears. The movie becomes smaller, quieter, and much more physical. Ahmed has to move Kinley across miles of hostile terrain with very little help. Kinley can barely function. He drifts in and out of consciousness, leaving Ahmed to make every decision alone. Roads are too dangerous. Vehicles draw attention. Taliban fighters are searching the area, and Ahmed knows that being caught with an American soldier would mean almost certain death, so he drags him. Across dirt, rock, steep ground, and whatever cover he can find, Ahmed keeps moving. Sometimes with a cart, sometimes with improvised methods, sometimes simply through force and determination. The film makes the journey feel exhausting rather than heroic in the polished Hollywood sense. Ahmed isn't winning glamorous battles. He's surviving minute by minute. That section is probably the most effective part of the movie because it allows the story to breathe without becoming comfortable. There are long stretches where dialogue barely matters. What matters is whether Ahmed can keep going, whether Kinley will survive, and whether the men hunting them are getting closer. Dar Salim does a lot of the work here almost by himself. Ahmed's fear, frustration, and exhaustion come through without the movie needing him to explain every emotion. He is carrying a wounded man, but he is also carrying the entire narrative for a while. The film understands that, and it gives him enough space to become more than the interpreter introduced at the beginning. By the time they reach safety, the relationship has been completely rewritten. Kinley is no longer simply the commander. Ahmed is no longer simply the hired local working under him. Whatever professional distance existed between them is gone. Ahmed has risked his life repeatedly for a man he could have abandoned. That would be enough material for one film. In fact, there's a version of The Covenant that could have ended after Ahmed gets Kinley back to the American base. It would have been a tight, brutal survival story about two men learning to trust one another under impossible circumstances. But the film keeps going, and that choice creates its unusual two-part structure. Kinley wakes up back in the United States. The war is now physically distant. He has a home, a family, and the appearance of safety. He should be recovering and moving on, but emotionally, he never really leaves Afghanistan. He learns that Ahmed and his family are still there. Worse, Ahmed is now being hunted because of what he did. The Taliban know he helped an American soldier escape. A bounty has been placed on him, forcing Ahmed, his wife, and their child into hiding. This is where the rescue story begins. Kinley assumes that the promise made to Ahmed will be honored. Ahmed worked with the American military under the expectation that he and his family would receive visas and safe relocation. After everything he sacrificed, that should be the easy part. It isn't. Kinley calls offices, speaks with officials, fills out paperwork, and tries to push the process forward, but he keeps meeting the same thing. Delays, confusion, and people who sound sympathetic without actually solving anything. The enemy in this part of the film isn't standing on a mountain with a rifle. It's a system that keeps moving responsibility from one desk to another. That shift slows the movie down, and for some viewers it may feel like the story has lost momentum. The first half is built around immediate physical danger. The middle deals with phone calls, frustration, and Kinley's growing inability to live normally, while the man who saved him remains trapped. Still, the slowdown has a purpose. Kinley's rescue mission doesn't begin because he suddenly misses combat. It begins because doing nothing becomes unbearable. He can't accept that Ahmed saved his life only to be abandoned by the same country he was helping. At a certain point, he stops waiting for official channels to work. He uses military contacts, finds people operating inside Afghanistan, and arranges a private extraction. The plan is dangerous, expensive, and probably far less reliable than he wants to believe, but he sees no other option. So the film returns to Afghanistan. This time, Kinley is the one entering hostile territory to save Ahmed. The reversal is the whole point. Earlier, Ahmed carried Kinley through the country while enemies searched for them. Now Kinley is moving through that same danger because Ahmed and his family have nowhere else to go. The rescue mission gives the title its meaning. The Covenant isn't a formal military contract. It's the obligation created when one person gives everything to save another. The structure is risky because the two halves almost feel like separate films. The first is a survival thriller. The second is a rescue operation mixed with bureaucratic frustration and personal guilt. They have different rhythms, different kinds of tension, and even different emotional centers. That won't work for everyone. Some may prefer the raw simplicity of Ahmed's journey and feel the later section becomes more conventional. The final rescue includes larger action beats and a more familiar Hollywood sense of escalation. The grounded tension of the earlier scenes gives way to something louder, and more openly designed as a climax. But the two-part approach also gives the story its identity. Without the second half, Ahmed's sacrifice would remain powerful, but Kinley's character would be incomplete. He would simply be the man who was saved. By going back, he has to decide what that rescue actually means, and whether gratitude is still meaningful when honoring it requires real danger. The film isn't subtle about the symmetry. Ahmed brings Kinley home. Kinley returns to bring Ahmed home. One man acts first because survival demands it. The other acts later because conscience demands it. That makes the rescue narrative emotionally simple, but not empty. You understand Kinley's motivation immediately. There is no complicated mystery, no hidden agenda, and no sudden twist revealing that Ahmed was secretly someone else. It is a story about a debt that cannot be repaid with words. And even when the final act becomes more polished and conventional than the earlier survival section, the emotional logic remains clear. Kinley isn't returning for military glory. He isn't trying to win the war that his country is already leaving behind. He is going back for one man and one family. That smaller objective gives the movie more weight than the scale of its action scenes. The war around them is enormous, political, and impossible for either character to control. Their promise to one another is the one thing they can still choose to honor. The heart of the covenant is not the war, the rescue mission, or even the political anger running beneath the story. It is the relationship between Kinley and Ahmed, and the film is smart enough not to make that relationship warm or easy from the beginning. When Ahmed first joins the unit, Kinley does not treat him like a future brother-in-arms. He treats him like an interpreter. That distinction matters. Ahmed is there to translate, help the soldiers communicate with locals, and guide them through situations they do not fully understand. Kinley expects him to follow instructions and remain within the limits of that role. Ahmed, however, is not interested in behaving like a passive tool. He listens differently. He watches people's reactions. He notices when answers feel rehearsed, or when fear is hiding underneath a conversation. Sometimes he refuses to translate something exactly as it was said, because he knows the literal words are not the whole truth. Kinley sees that as insubordination. Ahmed sees it as survival. Their early exchanges have a slight edge to them. Neither man is especially talkative, and neither seems interested in explaining himself more than necessary. Kinley is disciplined, direct, and used to being obeyed. Ahmed is equally stubborn, but his authority comes from understanding the country in a way the soldiers never can. There is no instant friendship here. No forced scene where they suddenly discover they have everything in common. Trust develops because Ahmed repeatedly proves useful when it matters. He takes risks with information. He challenges assumptions. He senses danger before the unit fully understands what is happening. Kinley may not always appreciate the method, but he begins to respect the result. Ahmed's motivations also make him more complicated than someone simply working for a visa. The promise of relocation is clearly important. He has a wife and child to protect, and the opportunity to leave Afghanistan offers them a future. But his hostility toward the Taliban feels personal. There is anger beneath his calm manner, even if the film does not spend much time explaining every part of it. He is not helping the Americans because he blindly believes in them. He has his own reasons. That gives the partnership a more believable foundation. Ahmed is not following Kinley out of worship or simple gratitude. Both men enter the relationship with separate goals, and those goals only begin to overlap after they have faced danger together. Then the ambush changes everything. When Kinley is wounded and the rest of the unit is killed, Ahmed is given a choice the movie never needs to announce out loud. He can leave. Staying with Kinley dramatically reduces his own chances of survival. Carrying an unconscious American soldier through Taliban-controlled territory makes him slower, more visible, and far more valuable to the people hunting them. Nobody would be there to accuse Ahmed of cowardice if he walked away. Kinley might not even survive long enough to know. Ahmed stays anyway. That decision is where the relationship moves beyond employment, rank, and military obligation. Ahmed is no longer protecting his sergeant because it is part of the job. He is doing it because abandoning him has become morally impossible. The rescue itself is not presented as one grand act of heroism. It is a chain of smaller decisions, each one giving Ahmed another chance to stop. He drags Kinley until his body begins to fail. He hides him. He finds ways around roads and patrols. He keeps moving through exhaustion, fear, and physical pain without knowing whether there will be any reward waiting at the end. The distance between them also disappears during this section. Kinley, who began as the man giving orders, is completely dependent on Ahmed. He cannot command his way out. His rank means nothing. His nationality means nothing. His survival rests entirely in the hands of the person who was previously treated as support staff. That reversal is quietly important. Ahmed is carrying Kinley physically, but he is also carrying the weight of the film. For a long stretch, there is no squad dynamic, no military planning, and barely any conversation. Dar Salim has to make Ahmed's determination understandable through movement, expression, and exhaustion. He does. By the time Kinley reaches safety, the audience understands the scale of what Ahmed has done even if Kinley himself cannot remember every moment of it. Back in the United States, that missing memory almost makes the debt worse. Kinley knows he survived because of Ahmed, but the rescue comes back to him in fragments. He remembers sensations, glimpses, and the knowledge that another man refused to leave him behind. It is less like a clean, heroic memory, and more like something lodged in his mind that he cannot settle. He returns to his family, his business, and the safety of ordinary life, yet none of it feels entirely available to him. Ahmed is still there, not physically, obviously, but in every quiet moment where Kinley knows that the man responsible for his survival has been left behind. Ahmed is hiding with his family, while Kinley is standing beside a barbecue in his own backyard. One man has returned to normality. The other has a bounty on his head because of the rescue that made that normality possible. That imbalance eats at Kinley. The film could have treated this as simple gratitude, but it is closer to survivor's guilt mixed with moral shame. Kinley is not merely thankful. He feels implicated. He was part of the military that promised protection. He benefited from Ahmed's loyalty. Then the system carried him home and forgot the other man existed. Kinley's anger during the bureaucratic scenes comes from that contradiction. He calls government offices and tries to explain the urgency, but the people on the other end hear another case number. They offer procedures, delays, and polite language while Ahmed's situation becomes more dangerous by the day. For Kinley, this is not paperwork. It is a life debt. That phrase can sound overly dramatic, but the movie makes it literal. Without Ahmed, Kinley would be dead. Every day he spends safely at home is a day made possible by someone who is now being hunted. The promise to help Ahmed is therefore not presented as charity. Kinley is not returning to Afghanistan because he suddenly becomes a generous man. He is returning because he believes the debt has already been created, and refusing to act would mean accepting a version of himself he could not live with. That is what separates the central relationship from the usual war movie friendship. Kinley and Ahmed are not especially expressive with each other. They do not deliver long speeches about brotherhood. Most of their connection is built through action, irritation, silence, and moments where one man chooses not to leave the other. The film understands that loyalty is often clearer when nobody announces it. Ahmed's sacrifice comes first and without a guarantee of repayment. Kinley's comes later, after the institutions around him have failed. Their actions mirror each other, but they are not identical. Ahmed saves Kinley in the middle of immediate danger. There is no time to calculate consequences. Kinley has time. He can stay home. He can tell himself that he tried. He can blame the government, the military, or the immigration system and probably be correct. He has a family, responsibilities, and every reasonable excuse not to go back. That makes his decision different. He knows exactly what he is risking. There is also something interesting in the way their roles change. At the beginning, Kinley has the authority and Ahmed has the local knowledge. During the survival journey, Ahmed becomes the protector. During the final rescue, Kinley attempts to return that protection. By then, they are no longer commander and interpreter. They are two men connected by something that neither military paperwork nor official promises can properly describe. That is where the title finally earns its place. A covenant is stronger than a casual promise. It carries the idea of obligation, trust, and a commitment that still matters when keeping it becomes inconvenient or dangerous. The American government makes a promise to Ahmed and fails to honor it. Kinley makes a personal commitment and refuses to let it disappear into the same system. The contrast is not subtle, but it works. Institutions speak in guarantees and then hide behind procedure. Ahmed and Kinley barely speak about loyalty, yet both of them act on it. The emotional power of the film depends on believing this bond, and for the most part, it works because the actors avoid overselling it. Gyllenhaal plays Kinley as a man who does not always know how to express gratitude without turning it into anger or action. Salim gives Ahmed a calm, guarded presence that prevents him from becoming a saintly symbol. Ahmed can be difficult, Kinley can be cold, they frustrate each other. That makes the loyalty more convincing. They do not save each other because they are perfect friends. They save each other because somewhere along the way, the other person's life becomes something they are unwilling to abandon. The movie has explosions, gunfights, and military hardware, but but its most important idea is much quieter than any of that. A promise means very little when it is easy to keep. The real test comes when honoring it demands something from you. Ahmed passes that test first. Kinley spends the rest of the film trying to prove that he can pass it too. What gives the covenant real weight is the fact that Ahmed's situation was never just a convenient invention for an action movie. The characters may be fictional, or at least composites inspired by different experiences, but the larger failure behind the story is painfully real. Afghan interpreters worked alongside American and Allied forces for years. They translated conversations, guided troops through unfamiliar communities, identified threats, and often stood in the same line of fire as the soldiers they were assisting. They did that under the promise that their service would eventually earn them protection. For many of them, that promise meant visas, relocation, and a chance to take their families somewhere safe. It wasn't some generous reward handed out after the fact. It was part of the agreement from the beginning. Help us, take these risks, make yourself a target, and we will not leave you behind. The film takes that massive political failure and brings it down to one man. Ahmed is useful to the military because he understands the language, the culture, and the people around them. He can hear something in a person's voice that Kinley cannot. He can tell when a translation is technically correct, but the meaning underneath it is false. He knows when fear is shaping a conversation and when someone is trying to lead the soldiers into a trap. That knowledge saves lives, but it also makes him visible. To the American unit, Ahmed is an interpreter. To the Taliban, he is a collaborator. His job places him and his family in danger long before he drags an injured American sergeant across Afghanistan. Once that rescue becomes known, the risk is no longer theoretical. A bounty is placed on him, and his family is forced into hiding. The terrible irony is that Ahmed fulfills his side of the agreement completely. He does more than translate. He takes risks beyond what anyone could reasonably demand from him. He protects Kinley after the mission has collapsed. He keeps moving when walking away would be safer. He gets an American soldier back to the base alive, even though doing so almost guarantees that he will be hunted afterward. Then the institution that benefited from his courage fails to do the simple part. It does not get him out. This is where the Covenant becomes more than a straightforward rescue thriller. The second half is built around action, yes, but underneath that is a story about what happens when official promises have no human being willing to take responsibility for them. Kinley assumes that once the military understands Ahmed's situation, the problem will be solved. That seems reasonable. Ahmed saved an American sergeant. His service is documented. His family is in immediate danger. The case should be urgent and obvious. Instead, Kinley encounters a maze. He calls one office and gets redirected to another. He explains the circumstances repeatedly. He hears procedural language, delays and vague assurances that the matter is being processed. Nobody openly tells him that Ahmed does not deserve help. That would almost be easier to confront. They simply fail to act. The bureaucracy in the film is not portrayed as one dramatic villain sitting behind a desk and choosing cruelty. It is shapeless. Everyone has a limited role. Everyone follows a process. Everyone can say the situation is unfortunate while passing responsibility somewhere else. And meanwhile, Ahmed is still hiding. That contrast is more unsettling than a loud political speech would have been. Kinley is safe in the United States, surrounded by ordinary life, trying to make people understand that the clock is running out. Ahmed is moving from place to place with his wife and child because being discovered could mean death. For the people handling the paperwork, time is administrative. For Ahmed, time is survival. The film is clearly angry about this, although it expresses that anger through Kinley rather than through a detailed explanation of policy. He becomes increasingly frustrated because the gap between the urgency of the situation and the calmness of the official response is impossible for him to accept. He has seen what Ahmed did. The people on the phone have not. To them, Ahmed risks becoming another name in a system crowded with names. To Kinley, he is the reason he is alive. That personal connection gives Kinley the motivation to keep pushing, but it also exposes the larger injustice. Ahmed should not need a specific American soldier fighting for him in order to receive what he was promised. His safety should not depend on whether someone influential, persistent, or angry enough is willing to make calls on his behalf. That is the failure at the center of the film. The system makes a promise collectively, then demands that individuals fight to make that promise real. It is also why the story can be uncomfortable for viewers who expect a cleaner patriotic narrative. There are moments when the Covenant absolutely presents American soldiers as courageous, capable, and willing to risk themselves for one another. Kinley's men are doing dangerous work. Kinley himself ultimately returns to Afghanistan despite having every personal reason to remain at home. But the film does not allow individual bravery to erase institutional failure. The soldiers may mean what they say. The government may still break the promise. That distinction is important. The movie is not arguing that every American involved is indifferent or dishonest. Kinley clearly is not. Several military contacts try to help him. The problem is larger than one cruel official or one careless commander. It is a system capable of benefiting from someone's service without being equally capable of protecting that person afterward. The withdrawal from Afghanistan hangs over the entire story. After 2 decades of intervention, the country rapidly returned to Taliban control. Whatever political goals had been announced over the years, the people who had openly worked with foreign forces were left facing the consequences. The film does not attempt to explain every decision that led there. It is not a complete history of the war, and honestly, trying to make it one would have overwhelmed the story. Instead, it asks a smaller and more direct question. What happens to the people who trusted you? That is where the movie is most effective politically. It avoids turning Ahmed into a statistic, even though the final message points toward the much larger number of interpreters and local allies who faced similar danger. Statistics are easy to acknowledge and then forget. Ahmed is harder to dismiss because the audience has watched him earn that promise. We see his judgment save the unit. We see his independence create friction with Kinley. We see him refuse to abandon a wounded man. By the time the visa problem becomes central, the audience already understands what his service cost him. The film also treats Afghan interpreters as more than accessories to American soldiers, at least when it is focused on Ahmed. He has his own reasons for opposing the Taliban. He has a family and a future that exist beyond Kinley's story. His work is not simply proof of American influence or kindness. He is making calculated choices in a country where every side can demand loyalty and punish disobedience. That makes his situation more complicated than the familiar image of a grateful local helper. Ahmed is not helping because he believes the United States is flawless. He is helping because the Taliban represents a danger he understands personally, because the work provides for his family, and because relocation offers a possible escape. His cooperation is practical, moral, and deeply risky all at once. The film respects that complexity in its quieter moments. At the same time, there is a contradiction in how the movie handles its politics. It criticizes American abandonment, but it also delivers some very traditional images of American military power. By the final act, the rescue becomes larger, louder, and more openly heroic. A gunship arrives. Firepower overwhelms the enemy. The audience is invited to feel the relief and excitement of military force finally being used in the service of the people we care about. That sequence works as action filmmaking. Politically, it is a little messier. The movie spends much of its runtime showing that military power could not fulfill the promises made during the occupation. The frustration of looking at Kinley's unconscious body and knowing that he has chosen to make this man's survival his responsibility. That is where Ahmed becomes the film's most fully realized character. It is also why many viewers felt Salim outshone Gyllenhaal. That is not necessarily because Gyllenhaal is weak. It is partly because Ahmed receives the more demanding physical and emotional journey during the film's strongest section. Kinley spends much of that portion injured or unconscious, while Ahmed has to make every decision and absorb every consequence. Salim quite literally carries the film while his character carries Kinley. It is an obvious observation, but it is also true. By the time the story shifts back to America, Ahmed has earned the audience's investment. We worry about him even when he is off-screen because Salim has made his courage, stubbornness, and vulnerability feel specific. That is important because the second half often follows Kinley rather than Ahmed. The danger is that Ahmed could become an objective instead of a person, the man Kinley must locate and rescue. Salim's earlier work prevents that. We already know Ahmed well enough to understand what is at stake beyond Kinley's guilt. He has a wife, a child, and a life that has been reduced to hiding. He is not waiting to be saved because he lacks courage. He has already survived more than most of the people trying to help him. The chemistry between Gyllenhaal and Salim is built on tension rather than charm. They are not a traditional buddy movie pairing. There is not much relaxed banter or sentimental conversation. Even after trust develops, the relationship remains somewhat guarded. That fits both characters. Kinley is not emotionally expressive. Ahmed is careful about what he reveals. Their bond is shown through the way they begin to rely on one another. At first, Kinley sees Ahmed as someone attached to the squad. Ahmed sees Kinley as a commander whose rules do not always match the reality around them. Eventually, each man recognizes what the other is capable of. That progression feels convincing because it takes time. Their chemistry is especially effective in the smaller scenes, a disagreement during an interrogation, Ahmed reading a situation differently, Kinley deciding whether to trust his judgment, the two men quietly moving through hostile territory without needing to fill every silence. Those moments give the later sacrifices meaning. Had the film rushed their friendship, Ahmed's rescue of Kinley would have felt like a screenwriting requirement. Instead, it feels like the extreme conclusion of respect that has been developing without either man fully admitting it. The performances also prevent the relationship from becoming too sentimental. Gyllenhaal does not play Kinley as suddenly transformed into Ahmed's affectionate best friend. Salim does not play Ahmed as someone seeking emotional validation from the American sergeant. They remain themselves. That consistency helps. There is an interesting imbalance in how the movie develops them, though. The film has a fairly high body count, and there are plenty of gunshots, explosions, and injuries, but the violence rarely feels playful. It is harsh without becoming obsessed with suffering. That is an important distinction. Ritchie could easily have turned the combat into stylish brutality, especially given his history with violent crime films. Instead, most of the violence is treated as frightening and exhausting. The characters do not pause to admire what they have done. They are trying to survive the next attack. Even the more effective soldiers do not feel like superheroes during these early sequences. Their training helps, but it does not make them immune to ambushes or bad information. This is why the film's first major battle works so well. The unit discovers what it has been looking for, but that success does not give them control. The Taliban fighters keep arriving, the situation deteriorates quickly, and the Americans' superior equipment becomes much less useful once the enemy surrounds them in hostile territory. The scene communicates a basic reality of guerrilla warfare without needing to explain it. Knowing the enemy's location, controlling the roads, and understanding the terrain can be more valuable than having the bigger weapon. The film's sound design contributes a lot to that pressure. Gunfire is sharp and intrusive. Explosions do not blend gently into the score. When shooting begins, it interrupts everything, which is exactly how it should feel. Quieter moments have their own soundscape too. The wind across the terrain, a distant vehicle, the small sounds Ahmed makes while trying to move Kinley without drawing attention. The possibility that another noise may mean someone has found them. The silence never feels empty. It feels occupied by things we cannot see. Then there is Christopher Benstead's score, which is almost the opposite of the film's restrained visual approach. The music can be huge. It uses sweeping strings, heavy dramatic movement, and themes that clearly want to push the emotion forward. Subtlety is not always the goal. In fact, there are moments where the score seems determined to make sure nobody misses the importance of what is happening. Normally, that could become irritating. Here, it often works. The performances are restrained. The dialogue is relatively sparse during the survival section. The landscapes are visually controlled. The score becomes the main element allowed to be openly emotional. It gives the journey a sense of scale without requiring Ahmed to explain how much the task is costing him. When he is dragging Kinley through the terrain, the music turns physical exhaustion into something almost mythic. That is a risky choice because the scene could have become sentimental, yet Salim's grounded performance keeps it from floating away. The actor gives us the reality. The score gives us the emotional size of it. Benstead had already worked with Ritchie on films such as Wrath of Man and Operation Fortune, and his music here has the same confidence, though the emotional tone is more serious. There are violin-heavy passages, low ominous sounds, and larger themes that rise under the action. Some viewers may find the repeated foreboding strings a little excessive. The film certainly likes reminding us that danger is coming. There are scenes where the music appears before anything has happened and practically lines toward the audience to say, "You should be worried now." That can become predictable. Still, the score provides much of the movie's momentum during stretches where the physical action slows down. It keeps the sense of pressure alive, even when Kinley and Ahmed are not actively being attacked. The final 15 minutes make especially heavy use of it. By that point, the film has moved away from the quieter tension of the survival journey and into a much larger action climax. The music rises with the scale, giving the rescue a heroic, almost operatic quality. This is also where the realism begins to weaken. The final confrontation is technically impressive. It is energetic, easy to follow, and built around a clear objective. Kinley and Ahmed are trapped, enemy fighters are closing in, and the situation becomes increasingly desperate. As an action sequence, it delivers. The problem is that it does not feel quite like the same film. Earlier, taking down even a few armed men feels difficult and dangerous. Kinley and Ahmed survive through caution, local knowledge, luck, and relentless effort. Later, the action begins operating with more familiar Hollywood logic. The heroes become more effective. The enemy body count rises. Explosions become larger. Slow motion becomes more noticeable. A battle develops on and around a dam, giving the film a visually dramatic final arena. Then the C-130 gunship arrives and completely changes the balance. It is a satisfying rescue in the simplest possible sense. The characters we care about are surrounded, help arrives, and overwhelming firepower removes the immediate threat. A lot of viewers will cheer. The film has spent 2 hours making us want Kinley and Ahmed to escape. When the gunship starts eliminating the fighters around them, relief is the natural reaction. But the sequence is also uncomfortable if you think about what the rest of the movie has been saying. The story criticizes the American government and military system for using Afghan allies, making promises, and then failing to protect them. Yet the climax is built around the spectacular power of American military technology arriving from the sky. Should we feel grateful for the rescue? Probably. Should we also feel disturbed by the sheer scale of destruction? Maybe. The film does not fully resolve that contradiction. Visually, the gunship is presented as salvation. Politically, it represents the same military power that could not keep its basic promise to Ahmed without Kinley forcing the issue. The sequence therefore works better as entertainment than as an extension of the film's earlier realism. This is where some reviewers compare the movie to Rambo, a video game, or even James Bond. The criticism is not that action films are forbidden from becoming exciting. The problem is that the first half establishes a level of vulnerability that the final act partially abandons. Earlier, the characters survive because every decision is difficult. Later, superior firepower arrives at exactly the moment the story needs it. That shift will not bother everyone. Some people see the final action as a deserved payoff after so much suffering. The movie has already put Ahmed and Kinley through enough. Allowing them one decisive victory does not erase everything that came before. Others will feel that the Hollywood climax softens the harsher, more interesting film hiding underneath. Both reactions are fair. The action remains professionally staged throughout. Even when it becomes less believable, it rarely becomes confusing or visually careless. Ritchie knows how to build set pieces, and the final battle is no exception. There is a clear progression. The rescue plan begins under controlled conditions. Complications separate Kinley from the support he expected. Ahmed and his family become more difficult to reach. The Taliban pressure increases. The characters move toward a position where escape seems impossible. Then the sequence releases all the tension through large-scale firepower. Structurally, it works. Emotionally, it works for many viewers. Realistically, it is a step down from the survival section. That unevenness appears in the film's violence as well. For most of the runtime, the violence has consequence. People are wounded, movement becomes harder, and death changes the direction of the story. In the later action, some enemies begin to function more like targets. They arrive, fire, and fall. The individual danger remains, but the fighting becomes less personal because of the number of combatants involved. The body count starts to blur. This is not unusual in war movies, but it does make the film feel more conventional. The earlier scenes are frightening because anyone can die. The later scenes are thrilling because we want specific people to survive. Those are different emotional experiences. One is based on uncertainty. The other is based on rooting interest. The film is stronger when it uses the first. It is more commercially satisfying when it uses the second. The cinematography adjusts along with that change. During the survival sequence, the camera emphasizes distance, exhaustion, and isolation. Ahmed and Kinley often appear small inside the terrain, and even when the frame moves close, the world around them still feels enormous. During the final battle, the images become more dramatic. The dam gives the action height and scale. Gunfire cuts across more defined spaces. Explosions are framed to create visual impact. The camera becomes more interested in spectacle because the story has entered spectacle. Again, it is well done. It is simply less distinctive. The rugged Spanish landscapes provide something the final set piece cannot completely replace, the feeling that the country itself is resisting these characters. The terrain in the middle section is not evil, obviously, but it is indifferent. It does not care whether Ahmed is brave, whether Kinley deserves to live, or whether American promises were ever sincere. It is just difficult. That indifference makes the survival story feel honest. A mountain cannot be defeated with a speech. The distance does not shrink because Ahmed has reached the limit of his strength. The road remains dangerous regardless of how urgent the mission is. That physical stubbornness gives the film credibility even when the plot around it becomes more polished. The production design supports the same grounded atmosphere. Military bases feel functional rather than glamorous. The soldiers' equipment looks used, vehicles gather dust. Interiors are crowded with practical objects, instead of being arranged for visual beauty. The film does not make life in Afghanistan look comfortable for the Americans, but it is especially clear that their discomfort is temporary. They have bases, helicopters, medical support, and the possibility of leaving. Ahmed does not have the same protection. The visuals communicate that difference without constantly stating it. When Kinley returns to America, the imagery changes. His home is safe, open, and ordinary. The physical threat disappears. There are no mountains hiding armed patrols, no roads that may contain explosives, and no constant need to scan every doorway. Yet the film keeps some tension in those scenes because Kinley does not feel settled inside that safety. The contrast between America and Afghanistan makes his guilt visible.